Hey guys, Rob here for Beyond the Brush. This is the cleaning and prepping of a resin miniature. For those who've been paying attention to the last two videos, this will come as no surprise. So the miniature I've picked today is one from the Journey Wrath of Demons Kickstarter, and it's the resin pig spirit miniature. Journey was a Kickstarter done by a couple of I think Chinese guys, not entirely sure, based on the Journey to the West stories. So I picked this miniature mainly because it's fairly large. It's 54mm I think, and it only has two pieces, so nice and easy to work with. So resin has properties similar to metal and also similar to plastic in the way you have to treat it. Resin is extremely delicate. Obviously, sort of for this particular miniature, there aren't any sort of really sort of thin parts. I mean, maybe sort of that down there, you can see how easy that is to flex. There's nothing difficult there, and also sort of in there as well. And that's sort of a reasonably thick bit of resin, and it still bends quite easily. So once you get to sort of the more delicate parts, and certainly if you're working with a 28mm miniature, that will have extremely delicate parts. As I've talked about in previous videos, the miniature I painted, I snapped her 4 times, just painting her basically, simply because the bits were so thin. So luckily we shouldn't have too much of an issue with this miniature. What it does do is exhibit quite a lot of the sort of things you're going to have to work with for resin, and that's things like sort of you've got the usual things. So you've got sort of mould lines sort of running along sort of the parts of the miniature as you normally would for well, basically any miniature really. So there's sort of a few sort of running along there and down his arm there, and I believe there's sort of a fairly reasonable one there. The tools you'll need are pretty much the same as for the others. Good knife, good pair of clippers, and super glue in this case. Unlike plastic's the odd one out. Most miniatures you want to stick together with super glue. Plastic's the odd one out because you can actually use that plastic cement, which makes a lovely bond. So what we're going to do here is we're going to start with sort of having a general look around the miniature just to see sort of what's going on. I think we're quite lucky. The mould lines haven't affected the hair too much. That would be a real pain if that had happened. And there's a few little bits sort of working down there. That I think we can pretty much leave because it kind of looks like a sort of tendon. These bits up here we're going to want to trim off because I think that's probably the top of the cane or rake, I think it is, a sort of rake type thing, and that's obviously going to sort of stick on there. So, and there's also a bit down here. These are similar to the bits you'll find on metal miniatures. They just kind of hold the bits together so that the miniature doesn't sort of break apart when you're transporting it. So similarly to metal and indeed plastic, the mould lines can just be scraped off. One of the nice things about resin miniatures is that the detail in them is incredible in some cases. Sort of if I can get a good zoom in there, you can see that sort of all the way around that band it's all sort of actually sort of moulded in, and you'd have a hard time doing that with metal or plastic. Now what you will find is that resin can be harder to scrape, mainly because of the amount of care you have to take with it. It is quite difficult to do because it needs a reasonable amount of effort to actually be able to scrape it, but you also simultaneously have to be quite careful with it that you're not sort of putting too much pressure on. You'll also find, and I'll go over this later on, there's bits like this. You can see sort of behind the ear here is completely clear, but on this side it's got this sort of tab bit, and you can just go in. Because resin is quite soft, you can actually sort of, for the most part, go in with a knife and just sort of break that out, and it's actually joined onto his neck piece there. So I'm just going to have to kind of sort of dig that out as best I can. There we go. So, and again, that's left a little bit in there. Obviously, sort of how involved you want to get with the cleanup is sort of entirely up to you. It kind of depends on sort of whether you're sort of prepping the miniature for a competition or just for painting. You'll also find it's kind of difficult to see, but sort of in here there's a little sort of almost transparent film. It's really difficult to actually sort of catch on camera, but they can literally be scraped off very, very easily because it's incredibly thin material. So again, I'm just going to go around, just kind of clean up the mould lines as best we can. Some are very definitely worse than others. The downside of this scraping is that you're going to lose some of the texture. Sort of if you've got sort of textured skin like we have here, you're going to lose some of the texture. And obviously you could, if you wanted, go back in and sort of re-sculpt bits of the miniature to sort of cope with that. But in all honesty, that's not something I particularly want to get involved in. This, I mean, certainly not in this video anyway. It's just for sort of the cleaning up and prep purposes. So yeah, there's another bit down here, so you can see there's just this little tiny bit of resin sort of left over there. There's a few bits in here. What you'll also find in some places, you get this sort of strange, almost sort of discoloration, and I think that can be one of two things. It can either actually be part of the mould because they're moulded in silicone. And what tends to happen when you're pulling it out of the mould is you'll sometimes rip bits of the mould out, especially in sort of detailed areas like this. You'll sort of pull bits of the mould out, so you have to keep a watch out for those. They tend to be sort of a bluish rubbery substance. Things like this tend to be sort of where the resin hasn't been sort of mixed particularly well, and there's just sort of bits, because resin is a two-part sort of epoxy type substance, so you just have to be careful in there. You can use files and sort of sanding pads like this, but you have to be really, really careful with the dust that you produce. I mean, scraping isn't too bad because you tend to produce sort of bits like this rather than actual sort of fine dust, but sanding will produce a very fine dust, and resin is extremely toxic if it becomes a fine dust. I don't think it's toxic because of what's in it. For the most part, it's mainly toxic because the dust is fine enough that it just clogs the lungs up, and you end up with sort of I don't know what it's called, but coal miners used to get it, black lung. I think it was called, because coal dust does the same thing. So if you're going to do any sanding on a resin miniature, be very, very careful. I'd recommend wearing some sort of respiration protection in that case, either some sort of surgical mask or something along those lines, and have a window open, that kind of thing. So this mould line down here is actually really bad. I'm going to actually have a hard time sort of scraping that down, and yeah, the main problem here is not so much that I'm going to sort of worry about sort of leaving the mould line. I'm not going to be able to scrape it down. It's more that I'm losing that skin tone that's on there. You're going to end up with a sort of smooth sort of patch running down his body in this case. So I'm not entirely sure. I think I might come back to that one with some putty or something and fill that in, and I'll cover sort of doing that kind of thing on a later video. For bits like this, you can just trim these off just like you would sort of anything else. So just come in here, just take that off as well, and again I'm trying to sort of come in sort of little bits in there. So here we've got a bit on the top of his finger, so we're just going to sort of cut in from both directions and just sort of take that out. And again, as before, you can you can sort of get quite involved with sort of coming back in and sort of cutting these bits out and sort of resculpting anything that needs resculpting with a bit of sort of putty or green stuff or something along those lines. The bit at the top I don't think I'm going to be too worried about, because it's essentially going to form the sort of the join point for the rake head there. So what I will do is just take a little bit of it off, just to give something to hold on to. So just so that fits better. The rake head's got a sort of concave area in it, so if we can fit that over the top, that'll give us a good join. Can't decide what's going to look best, but we'll sort that out in a minute. And again, I'm actually going to leave this bit on for a while because I don't want to risk sort of bending and breaking the staff. So I'm fairly happy with the way that's cleaned up. It's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but it'll certainly do for sort of the purposes of this video. So another thing worth bearing in mind is things like this sort of in here. Now that could be part of the actual sculpt. It might be sort of a bit of a miscast. Kind of depends how you feel about the miniature, really. From the look of the model, that's essentially his clothes, or well, sort of what's left of his clothes, and he's got sort of joins up here and sort of around the back, so it's obviously sort of fairly rough clothing. So I think I would probably leave that as being sort of a similar join to the others, but on another model it might be that's actually a sort of miscast and it's a hole in the miniature, so you might want to just go in there with a bit of putty and fill it in. Kind of depends how you feel, really. So yeah, I think we're good with that. Similarly to metal models, once you're done with sort of cleaning up the miniature, you're going to want to come back and wash them before you glue them together. And so that's joined onto there. Clip that off, that's good. So the rest of that we can just get with the knife and put into side for a second. So we're going to work on the rake for a bit. Shouldn't take too long, it's a small piece, but we do need to be careful that that bit round there is going to be very, very delicate, so we've got to be very, very careful how we do this. So I'm going to come in here and just take that bit off, and again just give it a little bit of a scrape, and then in here, these bits are almost too thin because you can kind of cut them quite easily. They're almost too thin to use a pair of snips on. In some situations you might want to, just to sort of reduce the size of them. So at the moment I've got it down to almost enough that I can sort of just snap that out of the way, so it's kind of joined on. There we go, nearly there. There, that's it. So now it's just a matter of coming back in, tidying up. These are the sort of the almost transparent bits. They're so thin that the resin's actually gone sort of almost completely transparent. So I'm just going to come in and just trim those off as well. Lovely. Okay, so now we're into sort of cutting pieces. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to brace the miniature as best I can and then sort of cut in to this piece. Now obviously sort of I am cutting towards my finger. Don't do this if you can avoid it at all. There are some situations where it's almost unavoidable, but as per usual, knives are sharp, be careful with them. You will injure yourself if you're not careful, and nobody wants that. So that's that bit sort of cleaned up fairly nicely. Obviously if I was doing this for myself, I'd spend a bit more time and I'd come back with sanding pads and things like that, just to sort of make extra sure it's nice and clean. I'm going to come in here, so I'm just balancing this on the back of my thumb like that, just to give myself sort of a hard surface to work against. So there's a little bit left in there. You don't need too much pressure to cut the resin. It's not too bad. It's usually fairly soft stuff. Resin can be quite changeable as a substance between different manufacturers depending on sort of the mix they use and the type of resin and things like that. So you can get one resin from one manufacturer that's absolutely solid and another manufacturer and it's quite sort of bendy. This is actually relatively solid. I know the sort of the weird resin that Drop Zone Commander uses, or sort of used to use before they went to plastic, that was really solid and actually quite difficult to break. I have no idea how they did that, and I kind of wish they'd tell other manufacturers, because it'd be handy to have miniatures made out of that stuff. It was expensive though. So you can come in and you can do sort of all the cleanup you want. Resin miniatures do take longer to clean up. Simply because of sort of the way the material acts when it's being cast, and you can end up with sort of little bits here and there that you'll just need to scrape off. So there's sort of little tiny bits on the end of the forks, tines of the fork there and things like that. And you can spend sort of quite some time sort of going around and sort of generally sort of cleaning up bits and pieces, but for the moment I think we'll call that good. So I'll do a bit of a tidy up. There we go. So there's our rake head. That's quite an interesting shape, and it is fairly obviously going to go on there. So I think in this instance, which way round you want it depends on sort of how you feel the miniature should look. Facing forwards, I don't know, it feels almost sort of a little bit more menacing to me. I don't know, I guess because you can see the sort of the actual teeth of the fork, I guess. Facing sideways, I think it feels more balanced. That feels like the way it should be. The miniature doesn't actually have a picture, so I'm not entirely sure exactly how it's supposed to go, but I think mine, I'm going to have mine like that. So as you'd expect, gluing wants to be done after you've washed the miniature. Resin is the same as metal. They use a sort of mould release to make it easier to get the model out of the mould. It's basically a sort of dryish grease, powder grease, and that's essentially sort of to make it easier to get the model out of the mould, and it does affect your ability to put paint on and also glue. I'm not too worried about these two bits because there's a fairly large, for a model, there's a fairly large sort of area of glue in there. But what I am going to do is, so I'm going to use the same glue as I normally do. It's the Deluxe Materials Rocket Rapid, but this time I'm going to use a substance called Zip Kicker. This is a cyanoacrylate accelerator, and what this does is it actually sort of pretty much cures super glues instantly. The downside is that it will make the super glue a bit more delicate, so it won't stand up to as much abuse. But with resin miniatures, you're unlikely to be playing games with resin miniatures. They're more likely to be display pieces, so they get painted, they get put on a shelf, job done. You're not going to be touching them on a regular basis, so essentially as long as the two pieces are stuck, it doesn't matter if it's a delicate join usually. So the way this stuff works is ideally you want to keep the two substances as far apart as possible, because this will cure this almost instantly. And I know this is made by a company called Zap, and they make super glues called Zap-A-Gap, which I've never really used, but I did find this as being the best accelerator. It's just a generic accelerator. You don't need you don't need any sort of their particular super glues to be able to use it on. You can do, but this I found was quite useful because it's the only spray one I've found that hasn't clogged up yet or broken in some fashion. So the way it works is you put super glue on one side of the join and you put the accelerator on the other side of the join, and then you put the two pieces together, and then the super glue and the accelerator mix. The super glue sets virtually instantly, and job done. The reason you do this is super glue likes to work on two joins that are smooth. They're smooth, they're touching, they're right next to each other. On resin miniatures you rarely get that. You rarely get that sort of super smooth join on a super smooth surface. So resin tends to be sort of a bit more bitty in the way it joins. So I find that sort of accelerating the join makes life a bit easier. So I'm going to put just a little dab of super glue on there. That'll do, that's plenty. And then I'm going to put that way off to one side, and then I'm just going to take this and spray. Sorry, it's a bit difficult to do on camera. Just spray a little bit on there. You don't need much. It dries, it sort of evaporates very, very quickly. So get the pieces lined up and join them together, and then just hold it for a few seconds. Job done. That is now joined. That's not going anywhere unless I poke it really hard. Right, I'm just going to put the cap back on the glues and stuff. This stuff and super glue in general you want to use in a well ventilated room. This stuff stinks and I hate to imagine what it's going to do to my lungs. It does say on the back sort of use in a well ventilated area, etc. So yeah, you kind of want to be careful. Resin miniatures are probably the worst in terms of health for you that you're going to be sort of fixing. The resin dust is really, really bad for you. Using the accelerator, you end up with this smell. You can see I've got a patch of it on there, and that's just slowly evaporating into the air. So I'm essentially breathing in at the moment, sort of all of that stuff. But you can see sort of it's fairly solid. You know, it's not too bad. It will come off if I sort of really go for that. It will come off, which does mean you can reposition it slightly, but you don't have much working time once you're using accelerator for obvious reasons. So last thing to do, just clip that off. Job done. So I'm just going to come in nice and easy, nothing complicated about this. Get in there with the clips. Bosh. There we go. A little bit of a tidy up on the bottom, and then that's basically it. Ready for painting. Don't forget these do need washing, as I said earlier. You want to wash before you build. So the order I tend to do things in is clean up, mould lines, make sure everything's ready to be put together, wash it all, soap and water, just generic dish soap of some description will be fine. Give it a good scrub. Rinse that all off, let it dry, stick the pieces together. There you go. So there we are. That is the pig spirit. I can't remember what his name is. Cho Hakai, I think it is. I'm probably pronouncing that horrendously, but there you go. Nice little miniature, quite like it. I might actually paint it up. We'll see. I don't know. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I shall see you again soon. Bye.